The Law of Marital Memory, Samoa. In the picturesque Pacific island nation of Samoa, amidst the turquoise waters and lush greenery, lies a legal landmine for the forgetful spouse. It is, according to widespread reports, illegal to forget your wife's birthday. Let that sink in. This isn't just a failure that results in a night on the couch. It's a potential infraction against the state. The legal system, a force typically concerned with theft, assault, and civil disputes, might be called upon to adjudicate a case of forgotten cake and belated flowers. At first glance, this law feels like the ultimate legislative overreach, a rule written by a committee of perpetually disappointed partners. But digging deeper reveals a fascinating intersection of culture, religion, and the colonial-era imposition of Western legal norms. Samoan society is built upon Fa'a Samoa, the Samoan way, a complex code of conduct that emphasizes respect, particularly within the family and community structures. The family is the absolute bedrock of the culture. Within this framework, forgetting a significant event like a birthday, especially that of one's spouse, isn't just a simple memory lapse. It's interpreted as a profound sign of disrespect, a failure to uphold one's familial duties that verges on a public slight. The law itself, if it exists in the formal, enforceable statutes, likely stems from Christian missionary influence, which blended with local customs to create a unique socio-legal fabric. Missionaries introduced formal marriage and the celebration of birthdays, and these became integrated into the existing Samoan value system. So, while you probably won't be dragged away in handcuffs for a memory fumble, the law acts as a powerful social deterrent. It's a formal codification of a deep cultural expectation. It signifies that in Samoa, the health of a marriage is considered so integral to the health of the community that the state has a vested interest in reminding you, under vague threat of penalty, to pick up that greeting card. It's less about criminal punishment and more about a societal-level intervention to say, hey, pay attention to the person you married. It matters to all of us. The law of the nightly flush, Switzerland. Switzerland is a nation renowned for its precision, order, and unwavering commitment to rules. It's a place where punctuality is a virtue and recycling is a science. It should come as no surprise then that this obsession with orderly conduct extends into the most private of spaces, the bathroom. In many Swiss apartment buildings, it is forbidden to flush your toilet after 10 p.m. This isn't a quirky suggestion from a landlord. It's a common regulation in rental agreements, backed by municipal noise ordinances. Violate the sanctity of the nocturnal silence with the thunderous cascade of a flushing toilet, and you could face a formal complaint from your neighbors. This law is a direct consequence of two Swiss realities: high-density urban living and exceptionally well-built, yet aging infrastructure. Many Swiss apartment buildings, while meticulously maintained, have plumbing systems that are not whispered secrets. The pipes can be loud, and in a culture that prizes quietude, the sound of water rushing through the walls at 11:30 p.m. is considered an unacceptable acoustic intrusion. The 10 p.m. quiet hour is a sacred threshold in Swiss residential life. It's the time when you are expected to cease all noisy activities, no vacuuming, no loud music, and certainly no flushing. The underlying principle is one of collective consideration. Your right to convenience ends where your neighbor's right to peaceful sleep begins. Skeptics often ask, what are you supposed to do? The unofficial Swiss answer, delivered with a shrug, is, let it mellow. This has led to the urban legend of the if it's yellow, let it mellow, if it's brown, flush it down rule having a quasi-legal standing. While the police are unlikely to storm your bathroom, repeated offenses could lead to disputes with neighbors and formal warnings from the building management or landlord, which in the highly regulated Swiss housing market is a situation best avoided. It's a law that perfectly encapsulates the Swiss paradox, a society that offers immense personal freedom, as long as your exercise of it doesn't in any way audibly disturb anyone else. The law of mandatory canine happiness, Turin. In the elegant city of Turin, Italy, home to Fiat and fine chocolate, dog owners are held to a uniquely high standard of pet care by the full force of the law. A municipal regulation stipulates that dogs must be walked at least 3 times a day. Failure to do so can result in a fine of up to $500. This isn't about preventing outright abuse, it's about legally mandating a specific level of canine well-being and exercise. The law doesn't stop there. It also bans dyeing your dog's fur for aesthetic reasons and docking their tails, positioning Turin as one of the most legally pro-pup cities on the planet. This law was born from a growing animal rights movement in Italy that sought to translate ethical principles into enforceable policy. Proponents argued that keeping a dog confined to a small city apartment for long stretches was a form of cruelty, and that a legal standard was necessary to ensure these animals received the physical and mental stimulation they require. They successfully made the case that a dog's happiness is a matter of public interest. The law treats dog ownership not as a right, but as a responsibility with clearly defined, non-negotiable terms. It fundamentally reframes a pet from property to a sentient being with legal entitlements. Of course, the enforcement is a logistical puzzle. There isn't a dedicated pooch patrol monitoring every dog owner's daily routine. Enforcement typically relies on neighborly reporting. If a neighbor notices a dog is consistently yapping, displaying signs of distress, or is never seen outside, they can report the owner to the authorities. It's a system built on social accountability. The law serves as a powerful public statement, shifting the cultural perception of pet ownership. It tells the citizens of Turin that if you're not prepared to invest the time and energy into giving your dog a good life, a life that includes multiple daily excursions to sniff, explore, and socialize, then you simply shouldn't own one. It's a legally enforced empathy, a city's attempt to legislate happiness for its four-legged residents. The law of suspicious salmon handling, United Kingdom. In the vast and storied legal history of the United Kingdom, few pieces of legislation are as memed or misunderstood as the Salmon Act of 1986. Section 32 of this act makes it illegal to handle salmon in suspicious circumstances. This phrase conjures hilarious images of a man in a trench coat trying to discreetly slide a 20-pound salmon into a briefcase looking nervously over his shoulder. The reality, however, is far less comical and rooted in a serious issue of organized rural crime. The law was not designed to target bewildered shoppers choosing a fish for dinner. It was created to combat rampant poaching. In the 1980s, illegal fishing gangs were devastating salmon populations in Scottish and English rivers. These were not lone fishermen with a rod. They were organized operations using illegal nets, poisons, and even explosives to harvest massive quantities of fish, which they would then sell on the black market to restaurants and fishmongers. The problem for law enforcement was proving the fish were illegally caught. Once a salmon was out of the river and in the back of a van, it was nearly impossible to prove its illicit origin. The suspicious circumstances clause was a brilliant legal tool to circumvent this problem. It shifted the burden of proof. The law essentially states that if you are found in possession of a salmon or any freshwater fish, and there is reasonable cause to suspect it was obtained illegally, for example, it's 3 a.m., you're by a protected river, and you have a car boot full of flapping salmon but no fishing license or equipment, the authorities can act. You must then prove that you came by the fish legally. It criminalizes the possession and transport stages of poaching, not just the act of catching itself. So, while it sounds like a law against acting shifty with seafood, it's actually a targeted and effective weapon against a specific and once thriving criminal enterprise. It's a reminder that one of the weirdest sounding laws on the books is also one of the most cleverly pragmatic. The law of the mandated smile, Milan. In Milan, the global capital of fashion and design, it appears that your face is subject to a dress code. An old and obscure city regulation, dating back to the Austro-Hungarian era, reportedly requires citizens to smile at all times in public. The only exceptions to this state-mandated cheerfulness are for those attending a funeral or visiting a hospital. Frown in the Piazza del Duomo, and you could, in theory, be in violation of the law. This peculiar rule is not a modern attempt at social engineering, but a historical relic, a ghost from a bygone imperial bureaucracy. When Milan was under Austro-Hungarian rule, the administration was known for its meticulous and often pedantic regulations governing every aspect of public life. The law was likely intended to project an image of a happy, contented populace under the emperor's rule. A smiling city was a prosperous and stable city, or at least that was the desired propaganda. It was a tool of political image crafting, forcing a veneer of pleasantness onto the public sphere. The act of frowning could be interpreted not just as personal sadness, but as a subtle form of public dissent. Today, the law is completely unenforced and largely forgotten. A piece of civic trivia. No one is getting fined for having a bad day. Yet its existence speaks to a deeper truth about the relationship between law and social expression. It represents a time when the state believed it had the authority to regulate not just actions, but emotions. It's a fascinating, if slightly creepy, example of law, attempting to control the narrative of public sentiment. While modern Milanese are free to express the full range of human emotion, the forgotten smile law lingers as a strange memento of an era when your feelings were not entirely your own business, and a cheerful disposition was a matter of civic duty. The law of unwinnable wars against birds, Australia. In 1932, the Australian government officially declared war on its own wildlife. The enemy? The emu. This wasn't a law in the traditional sense, but a formal, military-authorized campaign known as the Great Emu War, making it one of the most bizarre chapters in governance history. Following World War I, the government had settled thousands of veterans in the marginal wheat farming lands of Western Australia. Their timing was terrible. The Great Depression hit, and a massive migrating population of some 20,000 emus descended upon these new farms, discovering that cultivated wheat was far tastier than native scrub. The emus, large, flightless, and surprisingly resilient, were destroying crops on an epic scale. The desperate farmers, many of them ex-soldiers themselves, petitioned the Minister of Defense for help. In a decision that can only be described as supremely odd, the government agreed to deploy the military. Major G.P.W. Meredith of the Royal Australian Artillery was dispatched with 2 soldiers and 2 Lewis machine guns, along with 10,000 rounds of ammunition. The government sanctioned a formal war. The problem was no one told the emus the rules of engagement. The birds proved to be tactical geniuses. They would split into small, fast-moving groups, making them incredibly difficult targets. The Lewis guns would jam, and the emus would simply run out of range. In one disastrous engagement, the soldiers fired hundreds of rounds to kill perhaps a dozen birds. After a month of humiliating failures, with international media gleefully reporting on the army's defeat, the military withdrew. A government official wryly noted in Parliament, "If we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world." The war was a catastrophic failure. The government had passed, in essence, a law of extermination, and was thoroughly beaten by its intended targets. It stands as a profound and comical lesson in governance. Some problems, particularly those involving nature, cannot be solved with brute force. It's a permanent reminder in Australian history that when you legislate a war against nature's absurdity, absurdity will almost always win. The law against bear brawling, Oklahoma. The legal code of Oklahoma contains a menagerie of strange animal-related statutes, but perhaps the most eyebrow-raising is the prohibition against bear wrestling. The law is clear. Engaging in or promoting a bear wrestling match is illegal. This brings to mind a very specific and baffling scenario. A dusty ring, a cheering crowd, a human challenger, and a presumably very confused and angry bear. Why, in the name of all that is reasonable, did the state of Oklahoma feel the need to legislate against this specific activity? The law wasn't passed to prevent hypothetical acts of frontier madness. It was a direct response to a real and troubling form of roadside entertainment that gained popularity in the latter half of the 20th century. Traveling circuses, bars, and promoters would tour with declawed and defanged bears, offering cash prizes to anyone brave, foolish, or drunk enough to step into a ring and try to wrestle the animal to the ground. These were not fair fights, they were cruel spectacles. The bears were often kept in poor conditions, their spirits broken, and the wrestling was a source of immense stress and suffering for the animals. Animal welfare groups campaigned fiercely against the practice, arguing it was barbaric. The Oklahoma legislature agreed, and in the 1990s passed the law to shut down this specific brand of animal exploitation. So, the law isn't about protecting humans from their own stupidity, though it certainly does that as a side effect. It's an animal cruelty law, specifically tailored to eradicate a bizarre and inhumane blood sport. While the idea of wrestling a bear seems like something out of a tall tale, the law is a sober reminder that reality is often stranger and sometimes crueler than fiction. It marks the point where society drew a legal line and said, there are many things you can do for entertainment, but fighting a captive bear is not one of them. The law of chewing prohibition. Singapore. Since 1992, Singapore has been famously and almost uniquely gum-free by law. The importation and sale of chewing gum is banned, an act that has become a symbol of the nation's reputation for meticulous cleanliness and strict social controls. To many outsiders, it seems like the ultimate nanny state regulation, a draconian measure against a minor nuisance. But the story behind the ban is a fascinating case study in how a small, persistent problem can trigger a massive legislative response when it interferes with a nation's grand vision for its future. The architect of modern Singapore, Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, was obsessed with creating a first-world oasis in a third-world region. This meant not only economic development, but also cultivating a culture of discipline and order. Chewing gum became a direct threat to this vision. The problem wasn't the chewing itself, but the disposal. Used gum was being stuck on sidewalks, in mailboxes, inside keyholes, and most critically, on the door sensors of the brand-new multi-billion-dollar mass rapid transit MRT subway system. Vandals discovered that sticking gum on the train doors could prevent them from closing, causing system-wide disruptions and costing the government a fortune in maintenance and delays. For Lee Kuan Yew, this was the final straw. He saw it as a deliberate act of sabotage against the nation's progress. In his memoirs, he described the vandals as louts and decided that a partial restriction wouldn't work. The only solution was a total ban. He believed that if you want to create a clean and orderly society, you cannot tolerate even small acts of incivility because they erode the social fabric. The law has been relaxed slightly since 2004 to allow for therapeutic, dental, and nicotine gums, but the ban on recreational gum remains. It's a law that is deeply symbolic of Singapore's governing philosophy. Individual liberty can and will be curtailed for the sake of communal good and national efficiency. The law of the unnameable pig, France. In France, a country with a revolutionary past and a deep reverence for its national figures, it remains by custom and an old unrepealed law, illegal to name a pig Napoleon. This law is a historical curiosity, a perfect encapsulation of how personal pride and political power can manifest in the most peculiar corners of the legal code. It's a testament to the fact that even one of history's most formidable leaders was not above a moment of legislative pettiness. The law dates back to the reign of Napoleon Bonaparte himself. As emperor, Napoleon was intensely aware of his public image and legacy. He controlled the press, commissioned heroic art, and carefully curated the narrative of his greatness. During this time, political satire and dissent were often expressed through subtle, deniable means. Naming a farm animal, particularly a pig, an animal often associated with greed and filth, after the emperor was a potent, if rustic, act of political insult. It was a way for the common person to mock the most powerful man in Europe without writing a seditious pamphlet. Napoleon, not one to suffer any slight, however small, would not stand for it. The law was enacted to protect his dignity, making it an offense against the state to bring his name into disrepute by associating it with swine. It was a clear message. The emperor's name was sacred, and to use it in jest was to challenge his authority. Today, the law is a dead letter. No French farmer is going to be prosecuted by the Republic for the name of his pig. But the fact that it was never formally repealed makes it a charming and telling artifact. It serves as a humorous reminder that behind the grand sweep of history, with its epic battles and political reforms, there are also fragile egos and a law created to ensure that no one could call the emperor a pig. The law of counterfeit butter, Canada. For over half a century, Canada was embroiled in a bizarre legislative conflict known as the Margarine Wars. From 1886 to 1948, with a brief wartime exception, the manufacture and sale of margarine was completely illegal in Canada. When the ban was finally lifted by the Supreme Court, many provinces enacted new laws that still made life difficult for the butter substitute. The most peculiar of these was the color clause. Margarine was legally required to be a garish, unappetizing color, like bright yellow or orange in some provinces, or even stark white, to ensure it could never be mistaken for real butter. In Quebec, the sale of colored margarine was banned entirely until 2008. This strange legal battle was not about public health or safety. It was a raw, unadulterated example of protectionist lobbying by Canada's powerful dairy industry. When margarine, a cheaper alternative made from vegetable oils, first appeared in the late 19th century, dairy farmers panicked. They saw it as a direct threat to their livelihood and waged a massive political campaign against it. They successfully branded margarine as an unnatural and fraudulent product, a counterfeit that would fool consumers and destroy the wholesome dairy industry. They argued that butter is butter and margarine is a sham. The government caved to the pressure, enacting the nationwide ban. The color laws that followed the ban's repeal were a continuation of this war by other means. By forcing margarine to be an unappealing color, the dairy lobby ensured that butter would always hold the aesthetic high ground. It was a state-enforced marketing advantage. A restaurant couldn't secretly swap cheap margarine for butter without the customer immediately noticing the odd-colored spread on their toast. This bizarre chapter of Canadian legal history, which pitted dairy farmers against consumers and innovators, shows how economic fear can lead to absurd and anti-competitive legislation. It wasn't a war about health, but about protecting a powerful industry from the threat of a cheaper, functionally identical product.